Take us away.
Thank you so much, Austin. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. As Austin has beautifully introduced, we'll be covering the major changes within the ISO standard 14064 Part 1 as we transition from the 2006 version to the 2018 version. My name is Andrea Top, and as Austin has said, I'm one of the technical advisors here at Toitū Envirocare, and we'll be taking you through the webinar today. I'll be focusing solely on the major changes within the ISO standard itself, as yeah, and not the application of this to the Toitū carbon programs. So if you do have any program specific questions, please join us in our drop-in sessions in March. So if you have a look on our website, and you'll be able to see the dates and times for those. If you do have any questions that you'd like to ask today, feel free to leave them in the comments section or leave them until the end of the presentation, and I'll try my best to answer those. If we do run out of time, we will try to follow up with an email with an answer to those questions. So just looking at the agenda for today, I'll be discussing the main points of the major changes within the ISO standard itself, and just give a high-level introduction as to what those are. Then I'll be discussing the major changes to the categories, the scopes 1, 2, and 3, and how those have been categorized in the new standard, as well as discussing the importance of the intended users of the GHG inventory, and being able to identify what indirect emission sources would be considered significant or insignificant within a given inventory. So to start us off, let's go back and start with what is ISO and what is an ISO standard. So ISO is an international standard setting body composed of representatives from various national standard organisations. It is a corporation independent to government whose main focus is to develop internationally recognised standards. We are particularly interested in the ISO standard that ensures the quality and accuracy of the environmental systems for a given company. As you can see, the Toitū carbon programs are aligned with the ISO standard 14064 Part 1, which is specifically tailored to guiding organisations in quantifying and reporting their greenhouse gas emissions and removals. It is worth noting that there is a sister standard, the ISO 14064 Part 3 standard, which provides the standard to how to audit an inventory prepared under Part 1. Part 3 has also been updated, but we'll just be focusing on Part 1 for today. So the main aim with the international standards is to take the complex world of environmental science and reduce it to a simple set of rules and guidelines to help how environmental aspects of a product, service, or organisation can legitimately be represented on a consumer label or within a declaration. Essentially, it gives us a shared definition of what a complete carbon footprint should include. And put simply, the ISO standard is the framework that allows businesses to quantify their activities that cause carbon emissions within a given time period. So if you're not familiar with the scopes terminology, I will just do a quick overview so that the major changes in the new standard make a little bit more sense. So the activities that produce emissions are grouped together based on the level of control and influence you have on that activity. In the old version of the standard and in the GHG protocol, they were grouped into one of three scopes. So scope 1 referring to direct emission sources released as part of an organisation's activities. The usual example for this was fuel being burnt using a company vehicle. An organisation is directly responsible for the vehicle types that they purchase and then the amount they drive around in, so then have direct control over the emissions associated with that particular vehicle. Scope 2 emissions really only relates to electricity generation and consumption. So a business has control over the amount of energy they consume as a business, but no direct control over how that energy is being generated and how it travels to a given site. And then lastly, scope 3 refers to all emissions that a business really has limited control or influence over. How those emissions are then being produced. In the 2006 version of the ISO standard, scope 3 emissions were optional to include. However, as a program, we aligned with best practice at the time and included what we consider scope 3 mandatory emission sources. Those including business travel, freight, waste, transmission and distribution losses, and reimbursed travel as a minimum requirement for scope 3. So at first glance, you can see that the new standard has taken these 3 scopes and split them into 6 categories. No major changes for scope 1 and 2 as they remain category 1 and category 2. However, quite significant changes made to scope 3. In the new standard, scope 3 is broken down into 4 categories: transportation, products used by the organisation, products used from the organisation, and then other indirect emissions. So transportation is exactly what it says it is. It includes all freight, air travel, taxis, employee commuting, and emissions from the products used by the organisation. This includes purchased goods and capital goods, transmission and distribution losses, waste, and wastewater. And then emissions from products used from the organisation. This is mostly directed to organisations that have emissions associated with the use of their product/service. So an example being a manufacturer produces washing machines and in accounting for the emissions from the use phase of that product, they may choose to account for the estimated electricity consumption for that product's given life. Another example of products used from the organisation is considering the end of life emissions of a given product. So another example being a soft drink company may want to assess the end of life emissions associated with the plastic packaging of their product. Category 6 is yet to have an example of an emission source that would fit within this category, as all other emission sources we can think of fit quite nicely within all the other categories. So if you're familiar with the GHG Protocol Corporate Value Chain Standard, then you will notice how the new standard nicely aligns itself to this GHG Protocol standard. You will note that the additional categories and subcategories of the standard really look into the supply chain emissions, upstream, downstream, and as well as end of life. As mentioned earlier, Toitū has the scope 3 mandatory emission sources, which will be transitioned to categories and will remain a minimum requirement for program members under the new standard. However, the inclusion of additional emission sources will be strongly encouraged to align with best practice. So you might be thinking that these are a lot of additional emission sources to consider, and how do we go about including all of them? Which is a really good question to have. As part of establishing the scope and boundaries of a given GHG footprint, one of the major questions that need to be answered is, who is the intended user of this inventory, and what is the intended use? Or in other words, what is your why for putting together your inventory? So this is where we go through and look at the intended uses. So before an organization even sets out gathering data and doing emissions calculations, it is really important to understand, why you are preparing your GHG inventory. What are the intended uses? So, and you may ask your business, are we aiming to reduce costs or increase the value of our brand? Are we responding to supplier demands or encouraging staff buy-in? Are we wanting to, build GHG emission considerations within our operations or strategic decisions? Or are we solely wanting to achieve minimum requirements of a certification or program, GHG program that we're signed up for? So these are all valid reasons, and it might be a combination of reasons that could be your intended uses of the inventory. But the purpose of the inventory will determine the boundaries set and the emission sources that are included. So think about this early on, and it will be required to review your intended use regularly going forward. So this process is really the first step in understanding how the new standard may impact your inventory. This step should really be thought through and involve the right people within your organization, and should be really well defined and documented to allow your GHG inventory to deliver what you want it to. The second question linked to intended uses are the intended users. So these are the people, organisations that will use the inventory to make decisions. So intended users could be your board, your management team or leadership team, your staff, your customers, a GHG program that you're involved in, or the general public. And all these different intended users will care about different things. So it is important to design your inventory in a way that takes care of what meets the requirements of a given intended user. So for example, a plastic bottle manufacturer, a staff member may only wish to include the emissions of which they have direct operational control over, whereas management wants the company to assess the raw materials of that plastic bottle and understanding the supply chain emissions of said raw materials. So once an organization has a clear understanding of why they are putting together this inventory and for who, then this will help to make better decisions as to why you may choose to include or exclude various emission sources. So that leads us to the significance criteria. So in this simplified example, you see what an organisation must now apply and document to process to determine which indirect emissions to include in its GHG inventory based on its predetermined criteria for significance. So in considering the intended use of the GHG inventory, there will be various purposes of why and for who the inventory has been put together. So the standard is not particularly prescriptive about how to assess which emission sources are significant to to a particular organisation. So it does state that whatever the intended use is, the criteria should not be able to exclude substantial quantities or indirect emissions or evade compliance regulations. So, for example, if the intended use of the inventory is to achieve carbon reductions solely on an emissions business that it has direct control over, then the criteria to exclude various emission sources can be based on this level of influence. It is still acceptable to exclude emission sources based on magnitude or volume as per the previous standard. So for example, if reimbursed travel expense claims make up less than 1% of the inventory and access to the data is poor, then it's still acceptable to exclude this from the inventory. However, it is worth noting stakeholder expectations should be considered, particularly for the intended users. I think we've got a question. So is the use of significance an ISO concept or a Toitū concept. So this has come directly from the ISO standard. So this is the way in which you will decide which emission sources to include, exclude. Sorry, did Elaine, would you like to answer that one? No.
No. I was just saying that it's been answered live. You have covered that very well.
Okay. Not a problem. So, for example, a stakeholder may change the criteria for which an inventory is assessed. So, a clothing retailer wants to put together their inventory. If they set their criteria to focus simply on corporate emissions, this may run the risk of missing key parts of the inventory that major stakeholders, such as their customers, would expect to be included. So in the clothing sector, for example, under the current standard, outbound freight is considered out of scope as the business has limited influence over these emissions. Under the new standard, this may come into scope as it is what their customers would expect their inventory to include, and their customers are the intended users of their inventory. They may choose to even go a step further in assessing the recyclability of the clothing they are selling at the end of life. So the extent of the supply chain assessment is determined by the criteria determined. Another example might be an office-based company may interpret the standard to include only corporate New Zealand offices and emissions, but key stakeholders such as their board or other businesses within the same sector would expect them to include emissions from international offices. So if these key stakeholders are what define their significance criteria, then they may choose to include these based on that significance criteria. So thinking about this in the context of the Toitū carbon program, so this is a more complex diagram, but all it's saying is all emission sources are to be considered at this initial point, at the analysis, using sector guides, supply chain mapping, OPEX, asset registers, and a consolidated list of relevant emission sources is then put forward. And then using that significance criteria based on who the intended use and users are for, then you'll be able to justify and establish what is to be included, excluded within your GHG inventory. So the Toitū Carbon Program will be providing guidance and tools to support narrowing down these emission sources through this process. If you're working independently, the way you narrow down the possible emission sources and sinks will be up to you, and you'll need to document, but you will need to document this very carefully and keep all the decision making well documented if you're planning on being audited to the new standard. So to recap on the process so far, so the first step is establishing your intended users of the inventory. So your why are you putting your inventory together and for who? Then a significance criteria is to be chosen based on the established intended users of the inventory. And then a list of all possible emission sources is to be compiled and the significance criteria applied to establish what your final inventory will look like with justified reasons for inclusions, exclusions. So to those that have already established their GHG inventories and are apprehensive about these updates, do not worry. So Toitū in the process of updating all the templates and guidance documents and our software system to the new standard to ensure that this transition is as seamless as it possibly can be. We are doing so to ensure that our clients are demonstrating climate leadership and remain at the forefront of business-led climate action. Cool, so we have reached the end of the presentation. So if there are any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. When is the new standard going to be applied to current members? Oh yeah,
Belinda?
Belinda.
Yep.
Right, just get myself unmuted. So we're currently working through that process. We have developed updated rules for the program. They've had initial reviews by Jazans, who accredits us. So we're working on the timeframes at the moment, but our aim is that we can give our clients a year or so to transition if they need that. So the international rules say nobody may be audited to the 2006 version of the standard after the 1st of June 2022, so next year. But some clients or participants may want to change over earlier than that. So we're aiming to be able to start delivering the new program this year, this calendar year.
Cool. And there's another question. Will there be another webinar to address updates in the standards in the suite, e.g. part 3? I think you might be the best one to answer that too, Belinda.
There can be. If there is a particular interest in other webinars, we're very happy to respond to that need. So I know there's a lot of questions out there and a lot of uncertainty as to what the standards mean and how they apply to organisations that are currently measuring their footprints. So yeah, do let us know if there's other areas that we can provide webinars or other tools to help out.
We'll ask that question to you when we send out the email afterwards, everyone who's attending. So you'll have a chance to let us know if there's other key topics related to this that you'd like us to cover.
Awesome. Well, if there aren't any other questions, I guess we can. Oh, there's another one. Regarding goods and services company use, where emission factors could we find? They're very.
Yeah, that's another tricky one, isn't it? So we do anticipate that there'll be organisations that are quite ambitious in their measurement scope in terms of what they want to measure, and the challenge initially may be tracking down emissions factors. We're in touch with various parties at the moment to see what we can track down, and hopefully we can increase our database of emissions factors to cover more of what's needed. So it's a bit of a watch this space at the moment, though.
If an organisation claims an exclusion and auditor disagrees with this, means certification can't be given. No, I don't believe it would mean that. I think as part of the whole process in justifying the inclusions, exclusions, you would have gone through that whole significance criteria, and that would be given to the auditor as a means for justifying all the decisions that you've made. So I don't anticipate there being many disagreements at the time of audit.
There is a, not wanting to jump too much into detail on the audit standard, but there is an ability in the audit standard to give what's called a modified opinion. So that's effectively saying, yes, we've looked at everything that's there, we're comfortable that it meets the requirements of the standard, but there's these extra things that readers should be aware of. So those could be listed as qualifications or modifications to the assurance statement. That would be one way around that. Would you like me to answer the science-based targets question too?
Yeah, sure.
Go
on then.
Yeah, so the science-based targets is quite nicely aligned actually with these updated, this updated standard. I think that the Science-Based Targets initiative is still based on the greenhouse gas protocol, but the categories in the greenhouse gas protocol and the subcategories that sit under the categories in 14064 Part 1 2018 are very similar. So actually having those science-based targets is really useful, and there is more ability within the new standard to, or more guidance around target setting, which wasn't included at all in the previous version of the standard. There's not a lot of detail in the new standard, but there is a little bit basically saying, you know, if you're going to be setting smart targets, that, or if you're going to be setting reduction targets, they should be smart targets and some of those sorts of things. So generally good alignment, I think.
Yep.
There we go.
How early can we expect tools around significance to be available for use? Significance will vary potentially between sectors quite a lot. So in our developing tools, we are looking at sector-based guidance. As you can imagine, there's lots of sectors out there. So we're likely to be starting with the sectors that we have the most clients in, and helping provide tools in that way in the first instance. So we are working on those at the moment, and so over probably the next 2 to 3 months, we are hoping to have some tools available there. If you particularly are looking for guidance and tools, let us know the sectors that you're in, and we will do our best to meet your needs there. Yeah. The healthcare sector. Yeah, there are some really interesting things in the healthcare sector, and that is one that we probably will address relatively early. We would be really interested, particularly with clients involved in our programs, to have some conversations with participants around what you would consider significant, so that we can make sure that we've got, where practical, some sector-based guidance that everybody agrees on and everybody's comfortable with and everybody understands. So we may well look at having some workshops for some sectors where that's a sensible thing to do as well.
And actually, on that topic, we had a question submitted prior to the webinar, I believe from you as well, Victoria, around thinking about things like staff-related travel and customer client travel, and whether those are going to be required or not. And so if you want to speak any further to that one, Belinda, or Victoria, you might consider it answered now, but.
Yeah, so staff commuting will continue to be optional under the program requirements, but that doesn't mean that it won't be considered significance for other purposes that you're doing your inventory for. So you'd have to do a bit of thinking about that. But if it's primarily for program requirements, we wouldn't be requiring that staff commute to be reported. The travel piece would be largely depending on who's paying for it and booking it and those sorts of things. So if it's patient travel that's arranged by and coordinated by the hospitals, then that may well be included. But other travel where you actually don't have so much idea where patients are coming from, or where they're going to, or how they're traveling, or those sorts of things, we wouldn't be looking to make that mandatory for program purposes. And yeah, clients that, or your businesses that have a 30th of June end date would generally be looking to get audited August, September, October sort of time. By that stage, we are hoping that our accreditation's been transitioned. We're working with JazANZ on that at the moment. So account managers will be working with our clients to work out whether they transition for their next inventory or for the one following. We're aiming to have some flexibility there. But yeah, if you've got particular questions on program specific things, do feel free, as was mentioned earlier, to drop into our sessions booked during March for program clients.
Great.